Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about the happy demise of George Blake. George Blake, or George Bahar, to give him his birth name. So he just passed away on St. Stephen's Day at the age of 90 years. So he's born in the Netherlands in 1922 to a Dutch mother and an Egyptian father. His father was a Jewish Egyptian, and there were some Jewish Egyptians. Until the 1950s, Jews were about 1% of the Egyptian population, but they almost all had to leave after Israel was created. So George Blake's mother, she was a Christian. I'm not sure which faith he was brought up in. No, it must have been Christianity, yeah, because he said he had no idea he was half Jewish, and they were quite prosperous. His father had volunteered for the British Army in the First World War. Egypt then being under British control, they're not actually a colony at the time. And his father spoke English. George Blake grew up speaking Dutch as well. Anyway, his father died in 1936. The family, which had been comfortably bourgeois, was left in straitened circumstances. It was only upon his father's demise that he discovered that he was Hebraic. It doesn't appear to be remotely religious, George Blake, perhaps not his parents either. But I wonder how much that messed him up, discovering he was part of an ethno-religious group that he hadn't realised. So he was 14. And then he went to Egypt for a while, spent some time with his cousin Leon Curiel, who was a communist. It influenced him somewhat, although I don't think he actually crossed the Volga at the time, as it were. Anyway, so then he returned. He was back in the Netherlands by 1940, when the Netherlands was invaded by the Third Reich, coming under the governorship of Dr. Arthur Seyss-Inquart. And you really didn't want to be under his tutelage. So he was arrested for resistance activities. George Blake, I don't know exactly what, but he was released very quickly, so it mustn't have been too serious. Obviously, to begin with, after the collapse on the 15th of May, 1940, the Dutch underground was not fighting back. Resistivity was to increase sharply as time went on. Anyhow, he decided he'd better leave the Netherlands, and I always read how he'd escaped to the United Kingdom. I thought, my God, that was plucky. Or did he swim to the United Kingdom, or what? How did he get across the North Sea, being patrolled by the coast at night? Was it controlled by the British? But I thought, did he steal a fishing boat or what? Only yesterday to discover he went a rather easier route. He travelled through France and Spain to Gibraltar, which is, of course, a British crown dependency. And from there, he made his way by ship to the UK, and it's a good job for him that he did, because being half Jewish, he would have been killed in the Holocaust if he hadn't. So he was a fervent anti-Nazi, not surprisingly, any good person would be, but particularly as he was going to be on their hit list. All right, they didn't know that the Holocaust was coming. There was discrimination against Jews, but there weren't mass slayings in 1940. So then he was in the UK, he joined the Royal Navy, and he showed an early aptitude for languages. He was some sort of petty officer, and I'm not sure what he did the rest of the war. But anyway, after the Second World War, he was sent to Downing College, Cambridge, to acquire a Master of Russian, who was later to come to speak it with perfect correctitude. And in 1948, he was sent to the British legation in Seoul. So Korea had been partitioned. The idea was temporarily the Republic of Korea in the south and the People's Democratic Republic of Korea in the north. So Seoul just means capital of the Korean language, but that's the capital of South Korea. And presumably he set about learning Korean, and someone with a high aptitude for foreign tongues presumably is able to master it in short order. Anyway, the Korean War began, and North Koreans, fervently backed by the Soviets and the Chinese, they invaded. The British diplomat, he was taken prisoner. So obviously the communists didn't observe the Geneva Convention at all. The Vienna Convention, a diplomat is to be released immediately. Even in time of war. Even the Soviet Union, they released German diplomats in 1941. As soon as the war began, they battered down the doors of the German embassy, arrested them, but then let them go via Turkey. But obviously the communists were completely barbaric and would commit any atrocity, and their anti-communist allies also engaged in atrocities. I don't think quite on the same scale. I'm not aware that they mistreated diplomats in any way. So anyway, George Blake, who's a prisoner, and he later made some sort of deal with the communists, said he was willing to help. And he said the epiphany for him was seeing a Korean village being bombed by the US Air Force. Well, I mean, bombing obviously is nothing new, and sometimes villages are bombed. And anyway, I'm not sure how that was going to change things because obviously the Soviets, they were going to bomb villages elsewhere in Afghanistan and stuff like that. But burning the villages did seem faintly pointless if there was nothing of any military significance there, just houses doing a bit of farming, because all the young men were away fighting. But that doesn't really tell us about anything about the ideologies that were behind them. There was at least a free press and fair trials and all the rest of it, and a plural system in Western countries, and a higher standard of technology and everything like that. And of course, there were unfair aspects and failings of capitalism and democracy, but it was still a much prettier system than the alternative. This is the time of Stalin's savage oppression of people, sending millions of people to slave labor camps. And I use the word slavery advisedly, of holding political prisoners by their millions. And that was the system that George Blake went over to. But anyway, he was released at the end of the conflict in 1953, flown back to RAF Abingdon, and rapturously received. Little did people know he'd already agreed to help the communists. Now, I'm not sure how he set about contacting them, but he's in MI6, the British External Intelligence Agency, and really telling them everything he knew. And he's involved in many operations. Remember that Berlin was really the linchpin of the Cold War. It was a divided city. Communists in the eastern half of the city, the free people in the western half of the city, the French, British, and American occupation zones. Anyway, he managed to scotch various operations, tip the commies off about some operation to dig a tunnel and put listening devices there, which the Soviets allowed the operation to go ahead, waste a lot of time and money and resources of the Westerners, but make sure there was nothing for them to listen to, nothing worthwhile when they completed the project. And later, after about a year, rumble it. So they discovered by chance they didn't want to expose their source, who was George Blake, because he was a very valuable mole. He felt a bit miffed that his fiancée, I think, had jilted him in the late 1940s because of a family's anti-Semitism. So, okay, he suffered, and anti-Semitism, like all sorts of racialism or all religious bigotry, is detestable. Obviously, it existed in the Soviet Union too, only people weren't allowed to talk about it. Anyway, so he was taking the side of communism at the time that the Soviet Union was deliberately causing huge famines and starving millions of people to death on purpose, controlling every single gram of food. This was not negligence, knowing precisely what was going on. No dissent was allowed. Problems couldn't be faced up to. They could never be solved. The regime could get in with any crime. It had untrammeled power. People had no rights, and they were to be brainwashed, to be relentlessly force-fed propaganda, torture used on a huge scale as well, no freedom of religion, only a handful of churches and mosques open, all run by the secret police. So he handed over hundreds of courageous CIA and MI6 assets to the Soviets and their confederates in Eastern Europe. Blake said he extracted an undertaking that none of the other people he dobbed in would be executed, and in fact dozens of them were. So he's finally caught because a Polish defector fingered him, and he got 42 years in prison. He was very lucky to avoid the death penalty. It was high treason. I know it wasn't in wartime, but it had led to people's deaths, although I'm not sure that that was certain at the time. Or he could have been given life imprisonment without parole, but he seemed to be nonchalant about it. But he had some friends in prison, some anarchists and so on, who disapproved of what he did, but they felt that his sentence was excessive. Well, it wasn't really, considering he had been killing people. I know it's indirect, but this is still accessory shit, these people being killed. And I suppose they were lawfully killed within those countries, despite having completely unfair trials. So Sean Burke, I think, was a Limerick man who agreed to help him escape, and he knew Burke in prison. So Sean Burke he finished his sentence, and then when everyone was watching a film, Blake managed to saw his way through some bars and get to the exercise yard, I think, at night. And then there's a rope ladder which Sean Burke threw over, and he was got out, taken away and hidden by two of his confrères. But he moved from flat to flat, and eventually a camper van used to take him all the way to East Germany. And then he made his way to Moscow, where he lived out his days. So the Cold War ended, and he never ever went back to the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, would he have been prosecuted? I mean, I think he talked about in the 90s, but thought he could have been prosecuted, and he should have been prosecuted, which is to let people know that, you will never be forgiven. We will follow you to the uttermost ends of the earth, because there's hell to pay. He'd served only about 3 years of a 42-year sentence. Having ordered 42 years, I might have let him out halfway through or something. But I think in the Soviet Union, if he'd done a fraction of that, he would have been executed. His family would have been sent to these labor camps as well. He had a fair trial. He had lawyers for free who vociferated in his case. They tried to vindicate his case. He was allowed to speak his own defense. Even he never alleges he was mistreated in the least. I know the prison was not a 5-star hotel, but he was not physically harmed at all. He was adequately fed and all the rest of it. None of which would have been true in the Soviet Union. So communists are supposed to be internationalists and end up in the Soviet Union and ultranationalists. And now you see in the Russian Federation how chauvinistic the country is, despite the regime being openly nostalgic about communism. There's a cult of the personality, as there was before, so it's really about idolizing one very flawed individual who suffers from a severe inferiority complex. So they've got a dictator now, and yes, they have elections which are complete charades, and there's massive scale ballot stuffing. Not difficult to win elections if you have total control of the media. So they are rigged. It's a sham democracy. They've got complaisant courts, long-term wars of aggression against Ukraine, for example, and even telling blatant lies, flagrant lies that they did not invade when they did. They claimed that they did not invade Crimea, and then they boasted that they did invade Crimea, saying it was always theirs, despite the Russian Federation freely acknowledging for decades that it was Ukrainian sovereign soil. So this is very destructive imperialism. It's not even a positive imperialism. It's not like they bring anything good, saying they're against Islamic extremism, despite the fact the Putin regime, he openly promotes and supports a frank Islamist extremist regime on his own soil in Chechnya. So he's launching his war on freedom, murdering dissidents at home and abroad, poisoning them with chemical weapons, Novichok and so on, and telling the most barefaced lies constantly, waging this war on truth, interfering in elections and abroad, and on and on and on, ripping off the ordinary Russian people of hundreds of billions of dollars, his kleptocracy. His son-in-law buying shares for 3.8 million times less than the true value. 3.8 million. And you imagine what if you pay the true value, what that would have done for poor people who can't get decent medical care. But now Blake, he didn't do all this, but he didn't speak out against it, I suppose because he feared losing the benefits he had, because he lived in privilege in the communist era and since. No free expression in the Russian Federation. It's very censorious, very judgmental society, sadly, and there are many good Russians I really like, and people I feel very sorry for. So the kleptocracy is a mafia state, as it was to some extent in the Soviet era. So we didn't know much about it because, there was no free media then, and foreign journalists couldn't go there. So George Blake, bad man, served a bad regime, and I know Westerners, capitalists, and so on did bad things too, launched coups d'etats and supported anti-democratic regimes. So should also be excoriated. So that's him, the end of an era in a sense, the last of the Cambridge spies. I would love to have met him, despite him being thoroughly wicked. Comes across as unassuming, unthreatening, soft-spoken, gentle. I mean, he was not physically threatening. That wasn't what he was involved in. But the other thing about him is, I posted on this Facebook expatriate group in Moscow 3 years ago. Anybody know how to contact him? And nobody ever replied. Well, I should never meet him now. He'll probably be given a swell funeral by the SVR. Well, that's enough from me. Goodbye, everyone.